This episode is brought to you by Maplytics by Inogic. Maplytics is a market-leading certified for Microsoft Dynamics 365 geoanalytical mapping app. Maplytics empowers users with powerful map visualization and routing capabilities within Dynamics CRM to drive better sales, improve business processes, and engage the right customers at the right time. Maplytics now works with Dynamics 365 version 9 and the app for mobile and tablet. Inogic is a leading Microsoft Gold Dynamics CRM ISV delivering best-in-class Dynamics 365 solutions, as well as cost-effective and high-quality programming services. We thank Maplytics by Inogic for sponsoring the CRM Audio Podcast Network. Welcome to CRM Audio. I'm Joel Lindstrom here with my co-host George Dubinsky, and joining us is special guest Sean McNellis. Sean is Principal Premier Field Engineer at Microsoft. How you doing, Sean?
I'm doing pretty good. It's a little bit of a mouthful of a title, I guess, huh?
Absolutely. You got to have a lot of letters in there. So I been wanting to have Shawn on the podcast for a long time because, Shawn, I think, whenever I've heard your name come up with one of my customers, it's usually when something really goes wrong. You're like the guy that gets pulled in when something explodes or something, I think.
Yeah, that can happen for sure in the role, right? So that is one of the things. Like, what is a common question we get is, what is a P? So what is a PFE? What does that mean? It's sort of a Microsoft thing, right? Because it has one of our offerings in the title. And at the end of the day, like if I'm going to summarize it, I don't know about the best, but at a really high level, we work with the premier customers of Microsoft. So if you're a premier customer or your partner working with a premier customer or ISV, we work with those premier customers and we're an add-on to that service level. And our goal is to get to the point where we're 75, 80% proactive workload. Though a lot of times we do get called in when things go wrong. Our focus, unlike maybe more typical consulting businesses or even the Microsoft Consulting Services Group, tends to be more on the operate phase. So we'll get involved in implementations with partners, like yourselves or even MCS, and we'll review architecture, we'll review solution design, supportability goals, but really with a focus on like that first or second day, how does it look when we're operating? And then, other times we're not so fortunate to be involved early. And so sometimes it might be, hey, there's a big issue here, let's get involved. And we did a lot more of the parachuting in, and as the products evolved, and we've been helping the product group a little bit from time to time as well, giving feedback and working with more partners and customers. The reactive workload's gotten less, but a lot of people like yourself, we normally meet when something goes wrong, and hopefully we're walking out some hours or minutes or days later, and something works really well, and then we continue to keep on that front. That's the goal, at least.
I know that and how long have you been in that role?
Yeah. Oh, great question. So, I was trying to do the math the other day. I'm pretty sure when we started the PFE practice or the PFE role for Dynamics, I started right away with that team, right before we converted over to that title and that business. And I think it was about 12 years ago. And I've been at Microsoft. It'll be 16 years in January. I was brought on to help support the version 1.0 rollout that Microsoft was doing with CRM 1.0.
Wow. So I know back then, and even 5-6 years ago, a lot of what I would see you or Sean Deacon involved with was about scaling infrastructure and SQL servers and proxies and all that stuff. But now that most people are in the cloud, although I know you still have some customers that are 2015 on premise. I know one in particular where you've been on site, but most of the enterprise customers are moving to the cloud or have moved to the cloud. How has your role changed, in the last few years?
Oh man, night and day. I remember early on, a manager in PFE had said, I think it was both to Sean Deacon and I, and maybe one or two other people on the team at the time. But he said, "Hey, I have," and he was a lot around hockey, like he was a hockey guy, and so he said, "Hey, we're gonna have that hockey stick growth. I can feel it." And he was a little bit early on the trend, but he said, "Hey, nobody really wants to do this because it's so unfamiliar. It feels so uncomfortable. You could just get into SQL and do something with an admin or whatever, and now we have online, and it's so different." He was dead on right.
Can I just interrupt you?
Yeah.
Can I just interrupt you and could you explain for the audience what's the hockey stick growth is?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I went ahead and used a specific term and didn't define it. Yeah. Thank you for calling that
For
out.
people where George lives, you might say boomerang growth.
There you
Oh
go.
yeah. Oh, please. Okay. First of all, I grew up with ice hockey, so I was a goalie in my team. So,
Yeah. So
second,
I
yeah,
mean, just
yeah.
real quick, take a chart, a growth chart, with X, Y, and throw a hockey stick on there, and you've got that little flat bottom piece of the hockey stick, and then you get that sharp angle, and it goes up, and that's what we mean by hockey stick growth. That hey, you're kind of moving up a little bit, and all of a sudden you hit this turn, and then you go way up the graph, and you see that growth.
Yeah. All
So
I
how-
remember about hockey stick growth to me associated with the violence and fights.
Well, that's not good.
global warming, right? Yeah. So how is it changing now with the introduction of the Power Platform? Are you now supporting Power Automate Flow and
Yeah.
Canvas apps, and all the things
Yeah.
that are being piled on top of the Common Data Service now?
Great question. Yeah. So today is a very different world, right? And I think the opposite is true. But if I had an on-prem scenario, we're less familiar with it. We deal with a lot of automation and tooling in our job that helps make data collection much easier. And we've got mountains of really good statistical information and diagnostic data that we have at our fingertips. So when a customer says help, to most degree, we can help out a lot and provide a lot of value there. Yeah, and then even more so, now we've got Power Platform and Power Apps, and our CRM platform graduated into much bigger of a thing, right? Now Common Data Service. And so, yes, the needs of the customer are changing right now. A lot of customers are dipping their toe in the water with Flow around Dynamics and the Common Data Service. Some are experts there already for SharePoint or other platforms. And so I've been doing a lot more work with Flow. Customers asking for certain things like, hey, can we do insert idea here? Or our business really has this interesting requirement, trying to model that in Flow. Because for me, it's easier sometimes, right? Like just go out there and play around, drag some connectors around. Could you do this in a way that makes it way easier and more accessible? In the case of our customers, they've got a finite number of development workload that they can engage and work with. And so some of it too is let's model this out for the business, see how it scales. Maybe under certain scenarios, we do need to go write some code, but we can illustrate that with Flow. And Flow is super handy for stuff like that, and moving more of our workflow platform operations over to Flow and making that more compatible has been really interesting. Also, Canvas apps are something that a lot more customers are getting involved with, for sure. I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm working with a customer that needs to collect history or information, right? Data about their customer. And they're in a setting where the customer comes into a room and waits for an appointment. And so today that's all manual. Like it's digital on the screen. The person logs in and says, asks the contact that they're working with, hey, what's this information? Tell me this information. Tell me a little bit about this last month. And what we're doing there is going to Surface tablets or tablets and running a Power App to collect the data and queuing it up and then associating it with the record. So just trying to make things more accessible. And that's, I guess, the way I think of Power Apps today, in my position being, we've got a lot of customers who have spent a lot of time on model apps, this idea of, contacts, accounts, leads. How do we make their job easier, whether it's touching the customer that they're working with, or it's, making their business users experience a little bit better, flattening things out. We've built Power Apps specifically for a director level to get in and review data or look at data differently in a very much narrower viewpoint, or ways to transition from a report into seeing some specific dimension of data. Where a lot of times spinning up a team of half a dozen developers and a PM, we can take a little bit of PM role and usability and apply that to something like a Canvas app. And man, it really helps. at times, especially for those right scenarios. You can really get a lot done with that type of a platform.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you finding, Microsoft is doing everything they can to encourage people to spin up more environments now. Spin up, if you're under the new model, you can have as many sandboxes as you want as long as you get storage. How do you see enterprise, I guess, environment strategies changing with the proliferation of additional outside of the traditional, ALM structure of dev, QA, UAT, prod. Now you've got maybe some additional ones springing up. So as a PFE, how are you advising your clients to maintain control over all this?
Yeah, so that's the big money question. Governance and control. There's some interesting anybody in business that has I guess we would call them COEs or centers of excellence, or this is basically a team or a group that manages this workload for your business. So I'll give you an example. In a big, large global company, you might have a group that might include even developers and PMs, but business folks that say, if you want to onboard to Power Apps, let us know and we'll help you set it up and we'll help facilitate it. There's a COE starter kit that I think came out in about June. And they use Flow and Power Apps to automate the approval and like application process. And Microsoft is using some of this as well internally, like if I want an environment. So I'm seeing some usage of multiple environments, and it depends on the maturity of the customer, where they're at. And I mean that by like if they already have a lot of apps out there and they have a team that's running with it, or it's more organic and they don't have a specific business model around it or internal model. But I'm seeing environments be used for things like, let me carve off this section or this island for you. Now go model some things out, try some things, play with them. You get a little bit more freedom. And we know who you are, so work with it. But really, I mean, in the enterprise space where we have environments that are already deployed, I think where we're going to see the increase of environments is around ALM story today. It's interesting because I'll be honest with you, and I don't want to devolve into a licensing discussion, but this is super appropriate for the question. A lot of enterprise agreements and things like that are on renewal periods. And so, in some cases we have customers that are on a newer model and get those unlimited instances. And in some cases we don't. And so we're kind of in that gray period where for a short period of time or longer, depending on the customer, they may get those entitlements now, or it might be at a renewal. So I think we're kind of in that lull with the really big companies who are midstream. And then, the flip side is we have other companies that are coming in fast and furious that are new to the platform and want that help. So we kind of got a little bit of a mix of it right now.
Yeah, it's kind of, you're right. You before you answer some of the questions about how do I set up a new environment, you really have to know where they are and what plan they're on and how long till the renewal and everything. But what about like integration patterns? Like you were telling me before we started recording about how you've leveraged Azure and some other services, service buses and things like that. How are you seeing integrations done now versus maybe 5 years ago?
Oh man, it's night and day. It really is. I mean, it's sort of the same old thing, but not where,
right.
The needs are the same, but and you can still use the same tools, so to speak, the older patterns and tools and batch pull. But the toolkit that you can kind of bring to the job, if it was a screw gun and a hammer and some nails before, it's like a whole wheel-in kit that opens up into this workbench, right? Even if it's the same type of request, you have so much to pick from. And so I will say that I think every year we get more and more stuff in front of us where we can get into analysis paralysis. It's hard to make the move because something newer is always coming. But back to the direct question, integration patterns have changed a lot. And I think as you're going to see and probably already do see the product now, the Common Data Service and Power Apps integrating into Azure. So you'll see those things come up in Azure and they'll be available so that people in more of the Azure space can use and see those Power Apps and get into the platform easier. The opposite, I believe, will be true as well, where today Flow can talk to a lot of those assets. I would be, surprised if we didn't make it even easier in the future. And so the example I think you're talking about is, we had a need to text message people that we're working with on this deployment, and not just like 5 or 10 people, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people every week, tens of thousands. And so, scale is important. And so at the time, there was this batch process that would go scrape up a bunch of, hey, we need to notify this person of an appointment, or maybe they missed something or whatever, and then go send those things out. And that was taking hours to send text messages. And yet you're on your phone and you log into GitHub or Twitter, and you get a text message almost instantaneously, right? It's like, oh, there has to be a better way. So anyway, we switched the pattern a little bit, and we went, we have a process that pushes data into Service Bus through CDS. And then once it's in the Service Bus, we're using Azure Functions. I'll just, at a high level, we are, well over 10 to 20x the throughput or higher. And on top of that, we're at 1/10, maybe less, the price than running web workers by going to Functions. And so it's faster, it's cheaper, it's more flexible. The native connector, like writing an Azure function, for those of you who are, dev focused like I am in the background, developer focused, this ability to say, hey, listen to Service Bus, and then when you hear something, tell me about it. And then this is the code I want you to write. We removed 80 to 90% of the code that was deployed, because 80 to 90% of it was, developers at the time who weren't used to writing programs to run all themselves, right? So a lot of the code was around, how do we listen to a Service Bus? How do we know what's in there? How do we get it alerted? How do we manage threads and blah, 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 blah. All that went away, 100% of it. And it's just the core logic. And so we're in the world of configure first, customize second. But when you customize, you now have the ability to write just that core logic many times, right? And then you can write these little wrappers that call or put them in Azure Functions. And so, man, it's really cool, right? Because the worst thing ever, if I just want to run code, is I don't care about talking or listening to Service Bus, really. I mean, I have to because I want to listen to Service Bus, but it'd be easy if it just listened and I could say, listen to it and tell me when it happened. And the world now is so much different, and you can just plug into that. So anyway, that's been really fun.
There you go, George. I know you've been wanting to spam 50,000 people a minute with text messages, so there's your answer.
These are valid notifications, by the way. I'm just telling you. And we do maintain a whitelist and an opt-out. So,
I'm just curious about this pattern. The one thing that you mentioned that caught my attention is that you said that Service Bus, you maintain kind of multiple endpoints on the Service Bus. If Service Bus goes down, and I'm kind of like, wait a minute. The one thing that, in my experience, obviously I don't work with the same scale projects that you do, but in my experience, if anything is reliable, that would be the Service Bus. And now you kind of come down crashing into my world with the news that, hey, look, things do go down. How do you combat reliability? How you sort of prop your reliability? How do you deal with the fact that things that you should be able to rely on, like Service Bus, can go down?
Yeah. So in the connected world we're in, and cloud, I'm probably preaching to the choir. The really cool part is this is like digital Legos. Everybody uses that term, I think, or many people do. And I can just plug in modules, bang, bang, bang. Well, the same thing can go when you're building cloud products too, right? Like, I don't think it's any secret that CDS relies heavily on SQL Azure and blob storage. And so if San Antonio gets hit by lightning and SQL Azure goes down, there can be things that go down. And so one of those things might be Service Bus. Whether it's down, like unavailable, or it's impacted and slow, is kind of a different story. But I think the broader concept of, reliability is key. And I think we are highly available and reliable for most of our services. But planning for things like throttles, downtime are very important, especially in this world. And hopefully the worst doesn't happen, and there can be acceptable levels of failure. And in like text message notification, that's kind of a silly one a little bit, right? Like, I guess if you miss your text, it's inconvenient, but how important is that? And so the pattern though that we're using is for multiple things, and it might be for anything around, it could be health records for one customer, or it could be, debit card or credit card transactions for another, and things that you shouldn't lose. And so like from our planning point of view, what we're doing is we're controlling how that message goes into the service bus from CDS, and we're saying, look, here's the primary endpoint, here's a secondary endpoint. If anything goes wrong and we catch an exception on the primary submitting the message and we didn't submit it, then try the secondary. And unfortunately, that's been tested, quote unquote, in production a couple times where there was a problem with service bus availability in a particular region. And it was actually something we came back to a couple days later, working on more important things that may have been impacted. And we were very pleased to see that we didn't miss anything because it did just fail over. And it's fairly inexpensive. And some deployments and some functions might need that, many might not. And there are different ways to accomplish it. But
would you? Yeah, I was just about to say that if you can avoid sending messages directly to service bus and figuring out which endpoint to send to, since we're talking about patterns, one of the patterns we were looking at for sort of global service availability is something like, why wouldn't you use something like, I don't know, traffic manager, or I don't know, front door, or well, on a larger scale, API management, which is designed to kind of to make things available globally.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And there are different ways to approach it. I will say that in this particular scenario, we're using an Azure Aware plugin within Dynamics, and so it runs synchronously. And for certain operations, we needed to know that the message was submitted so the user could take action if it wasn't. That was applied to texting too, but there's other scenarios where that's more important. And so rather than go webhook, at the time, webhook wasn't available as an option, but your point is sound. There are multiple ways to do that. I have a lot of trust, I think you do too, in service bus availability and guaranteed delivery. Once you get the message in there, it's in there, and it might go dead letter. But so a lot of it is just around like, what's your tolerance for reliability? In this case, it was very, very minimal code in the platform. The other way to do it is there is a right click send to service bus concept right in the plugin registration tool, where you can say like, hey, on creative account, send this creation or created record to a service bus. That's done asynchronously, which is fine because you wait for async. Async isn't going to immediately return. There were a couple of these things where we needed to try and sequence them, and there were some other business and reporting concerns in this notion of certain things need to go out like right now, and we need to know if it failed. And so it's not that async is unreliable, but we synchronously push those across so that we can give the user feedback right away.
So what I was getting at is that we just discussed, and even now we sort of keep coming up with at least 3-4 different ways to do things. And for people in the enterprises, it's important to kind of understand the differences between the patterns and the way to use those to solve specific problems, whether it be sending SMS, or we had, in fact, in New South Wales in Australia, just day before yesterday, we had an extreme fire warning, never been used before. This level of warning. This is kind of services where you don't want to miss your SMS message.
Exactly.
This is really, really, really like life or death situation. So, so I wonder if there is any guide or guidance written down for enterprise architects or just smaller architects, like perhaps myself, for the smaller customers. Are there any documents out there? Are there any sort of things that people can take a look at and say, hey, look, I've got scenario A, I would use service bus, or I've got scenario B, I would use API management, and so on and so forth. That would be extremely helpful, but I'm not aware of anything out there. There are some enterprise patterns in general in in documentation, but nothing specific to CDS or flow, using flow and using Power Apps and things like that. Is it something that's common or?
So, yeah, that's a great question. And I'll be honest, like internally, we have consulting services and PFE, and we're in the same organization within Microsoft. And we have best practices, and I try not to use the word best practices. I'm kind of a fan of proven practices, because you can have best practices for stuff that's never actually worked before, because it's the best way to do it. And then you can have proven practices, which should be something that is proven out. And the other benefit is there can be multiple proven practices that work. Back to the question on documentation and patterns, there's a couple different white papers that have gone out for different scenarios, but they tend to be focused on like, hey, for performance, do this. And then they hit all these different scenarios. I'm not aware of any, architect toolkit or developer toolkit that is out in the wild as far as what's being maintained. And one of the, I can appreciate why. We have blog articles. There's a blog that my team writes on. I've been less active on it recently. I should probably write some more articles where we try to put whether it's architectural patterns or really technical stuff, or like, hey, here's a newsletter of what's going on from our perspective. It's called CRM.
Is that the In the Field blog?
Exactly. Yep. aka.ms/CRM in the field. Still the old branding. We're waiting for the branding to settle out. Maybe we'll
I think they changed the banner on it, but I think the URL is still CRM in the field.
Well,
exactly.
We still have CRM tip of the day, so it's.
You'd hate to change the name too early,
Yeah, they might call it something totally different next week. So,
but in all seriousness, we do have some things out there. I think it would be a really interesting community project, because it's tough to keep up to date. So like we've got our standards and kind of toolkit internally that we use within our consulting business, where there's certain patterns when they're successful and proven out. We put those at a high level so that an architect can look at it and go, okay, what is this about? And let me borrow from this, or let me understand. And those are tough to decouple from really specific customers, which is why I think a lot of these things don't get published really easily. But the other thing is they change, and they're changing so fast. And so it'd be interesting to have a Rolodex or library of architectural patterns. It's something that I would absolutely contribute to. I think it's tough finding somebody to own that sort of thing. And I don't know of any like really great one-stop shop, or even a couple or aggregated feed that helps there. But, we do, there's the Facebook group and other like community forums where I think a lot of good stuff gets put out there. I just don't know that it makes it into any type of library. So it's a good point. I just don't know of one.
So I want to ask you about a couple other kind of patterns and, proven practices. One of the ones that is frequently debated is managed solutions versus unmanaged solutions.
Ooh.
I just want to see what you're seeing, because Microsoft's guidance has always been. No, I just want to see what are you seeing in the companies you work with? How many enterprise companies are actually using managed solutions internally? And I guess related to that, CI/CD, deployment automation. Because I work with a lot of enterprise customers, but what I see is a lot of them don't have the staff or the people on hand to support that ALM process.
Yeah. So my dad has a company that does, they'll do like insurance repair and stuff, like commercial remodeling, and water damage is always the worst, right? Because water will always find a way. You build something watertight and it always finds a way, and it's always the path least resistance. And I think we're always fighting water, fighting path least resistance. And that's related here, because it's easy to create an unmanaged solution and not export it as managed and push it, because you kind of know you're dealing with a finite set of things and you're used to it. So the bottom line is, like, the answer is not enough. And like CI/CD and more ALM processes automate. I think Scott Hanselman says, if you do it once, that's cool, and if you do it a second time, that's when you start planning to automate. And it can obviously get a little ridiculous when you dump 80 hours of work into automating something that takes you 15 minutes. But the problem is not that it took 15 minutes and it took so many hours to automate. The problem is, are you getting consistent output? I think that's what these things can help us with. On the managed solution front, customers who have been on the platform for a while, I don't think are doing a lot of it. But I do work with several large customers that use managed solutions. And in general, managed solutions, you can do pretty much anything in a managed solution that you can do unmanaged. I don't know of anything that flat out doesn't work. And if it doesn't, it's a gap and needs to be addressed. And I think I'm on the same page with like Matt Barber and others and Shawn on that front. It needs to work. And as as you hopefully are seeing, Microsoft on our end, we're making strides towards better ALM, CI/CD capabilities. It's slow. I've been in around the product for a lot of years, as you have, both of you. And I would love that it went faster. But on the other hand, we're sort of balanced with fundamentals and other things that are really important too. So I would like to see more of it. There's more buzz. The connectors are out there in Azure DevOps, which is awesome. Azure DevOps itself interacts more with other Git-based platforms. So now I can pull code from wherever and build it and ship it if I don't want to write my own connector. But I would like to see more of it in the enterprise and in big businesses. And I'd love to see more teams start to do it. I will tell you, when we've spent the time to sit down and do it and automate, generally speaking, it does not take us as long as we thought. And the other thing is we wind up with much more reliability and better insight into what's actually going on. Because then when it takes you 5 minutes to do something and then it takes you 20 and you're like, well, whatever, not a big deal. And then it's taking you an hour. Now it's an hour and a half. When you have something that can be measured and is repeatable, there's like a ton of value to that. And as it's tough to find people that know this stuff. And so what we can automate and really focus our hopefully our talents and strengths on is not doing the same thing over and over again. And then you put the time into doing a document that someone can follow and do it for you manually. Human automation's not really any better. Like real automation is much
right.
better.
Well, I think what you were saying about best practices versus proven practices, you don't know how many deployments in enterprise companies we start and they haven't even hired their CRM administrator yet. And I just had this thought in the back of my mind, like, there's no way they're ready to keep a deployment automation going yet. Maybe when they have an administrator and can have people, because automation, you still have to have somebody to keep it going, right?
Yep. I agree. George, you were saying something there.
Oh, yeah, I was saying that to help you out, hopefully it's helpful. I pasted the link. There was an XKCD chart of how much time should you invest into automating a specific task, depending on how often do you do the task and how long does it take.
This is great. I am going to reuse this like today.
Yeah, 1205. It's like literally, I do accounting, for example, books. I do it every month, and I spend, let's say, 3 hours doing the books. So just looking at that, if I do monthly and if I do it for 1 hour, right? So, if I do it for 1 hour, I can afford to spend 2 days automating this stuff, and it will pay off.
The one thing with something like this that can be trouble is, and I'll give you a very realistic example because this discussion just happened in the last 2 months with may or may not been with a customer. We were talking about automation and release, and the result of the discussion was phenomenal point on saving the time. So what we will do is go to 3 releases next year, because then we don't do it as often, so we can spend more time. Unfortunately, the argument completely backfired and blew up in my face. But I think we're evolving on that discussion. But that can be the one thing that this doesn't capture is
once a decade deployment.
I don't think the tax office will appreciate if I report taxes once every 3 years.
There you go. I like it. Maybe the proven practices. We could do like.
Take it. Look, XKCD is a cartoon, right?
Yeah,
XKCD is a cartoon, so take it with a pinch of salt. Speaking of automation, you've been you've been very active on GitHub, and one of your uh, best works you've done it with Ken Nakamura, right? So you've
Yep.
done the XRM data PowerShell library, and personally, I always get confused when trying to explain to the customers when they shouldn't use and which library they should use. And I'm telling them, oh, you should use PowerShell totally to provision instances, blah, 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 to automate CDS. And then to move data in, you bring in XRM.data and say, wait a minute, is that the GitHub library? I'm saying, yeah, so. They're saying, oh, no, it's not from Microsoft. Saying, oh, kind of, and we get into whole discussion open source versus kind of official tools. Where do you see the role of this library kind of evolving? It's been used all over the place, but I'm just curious, what does the future hold for this library? Is it ever going to be folded into the official tool set for automation, for CDS automation?
Okay, good question. I don't have a crystal ball on the future per se, and without going into like a major history on it because it doesn't matter that much. But back Ken and I were geeking out in Seattle. We have this internal event called Tech Ready. Now it's called Ready, but we were geeking out on PowerShell. It'd be really cool to do this, and you could do it for Azure, but you can't do it for Dynamics, and we have the connector, but there's no commandlets, and it's really hard. And so we started writing samples for customers. And then internally, we'd trade them back and forth and test them. And then customers are like, let's do more of this. Let's do more of that. And it was really helpful. And then we had some internal deployments where they're like, I just want to interact with my Dynamics instance with PowerShell. I don't even want to use the UI. And so that's kind of how the thing got built. And then also Ken and I were geeking out on like open source and community. And this seemed like a really good fit because nothing we were doing is like that amazing. It's just processing stuff to try and make it easier and funneling it through a connector that Microsoft. So like the connection for those uninitiated with the library, the connection between PowerShell and Dynamics is a Microsoft signed binary. It's maintained by Microsoft. We update those libraries. And really the module, the power is in, pardon the pun, I guess, but the power is in, hey, get this, set this, connect that. And when I connect, it's like Azure connections where I'm connected. And now it's just part of my session and I can interact with my instance without having to pass connections around. And really focused on, we had deployment tools, create an org, delete an org, manage the environment, so to speak, to some degree. But there was no ability to get in there and work with the data. And so that's why it's called XRM Data PowerShell. Anyway, I don't know if it makes sense to pull it in and do that, or if it's, it's something I don't have a great answer for because some of the models that are in there and the object types and the way we're dealing with it is kind of on the, I would say, more legacy side of the house. It does use OAuth and you can do, service connections and certificate auth and such with it. But I don't know. We've used it in different areas internally, even within product, like to do certain things. So I really don't know. The primary thing I like about it is someone can say, this doesn't work anymore. And, oh, that's a product bug. Let me help that. And I'll go, try and connect people together or get a bug internally so we can fix it. Or, oh yeah, that's a bug in the script or something changed. Let's update it. Or someone can say, hey, this changed. Here's a something that will help in the module. So not a great answer on like, is it going to be signed by Microsoft? It's not owned by us, but the community piece of it, for me is really freeing because I can just go out there, write some things, add it, do some sample code, publish it, get it out to people like the next day. And that's
look,
really cool.
I don't want it to be owned by Microsoft, to be honestly, like because as you said, the freedom and kind of the agility of the development. To me, more the question was around, okay, if SOAP is dead tomorrow, what's going to happen? You did move to OAuth. That's
right.
great because I was telling this story that we just found calls from the customer say, "Oh, your stuff doesn't work anymore," and turns out someone went in and enabled legacy
Disabled basic
protocol.
auth. Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't really tell you why WS Trust stopped work, and it talks about POP3 and SMTP and other stuff. And of course, admins go in and say, "Oh, we don't use POP3." Flip the switch, and suddenly all the hell breaks loose because WS Trust is in use. So you moved away from that. So you moved to OAuth, but you're still using SOAP under the hood, aren't you? So
Yeah, it's using
get the data.
Yes, it's using Service Client. So this actually dovetails into a topic that I want to make sure we do cover, because there's a couple of things that I kind of had on my list. And that is one thing, like customers will say, I can't do OAuth because I use org service or I have code that I've written. And that is totally understandable as far as like, yes, we want the old code to work. We want entity, whatever, create. Yeah, we want all that to work. Absolutely. And we know, like I know that a lot of time and money and effort went into developing that. And so one of the things you can do is Service Client, CRM, SVC client. It's gone through some growing pains, I will say. But there's a multitude of ways to use that as your authentication and connection library. And that's exactly what we're doing in PowerShell. So if you look at the PowerShell source code, it's using a connection string, but there's other ways to do it in code. And basically we'll connect through OAuth, and you can give it, I don't have cert wired up easy. There's ways to do it. But anyway, if you're struggling on that front and thinking, oh, I don't want to rewrite this console app, I don't want to rewrite it, please don't make me rewrite it, then don't rewrite it. Use Service Client. And Service Client does use, as you're saying, George, it does use SOAP behind the scenes. And SOAP, for those who aren't familiar, is just a protocol for passing data. It's basically based on XML. So it's using modern authentication and more of a legacy protocol to pass the data back and forth. That is still supported today. A lot of our own tooling at Microsoft still uses it. And so like if you're struggling with that, what do? I want to get rid of legacy auth. CRM Service Client is a great way to connect. And then the other thing I want to make sure I mention is if you're not using application users, if you're using service accounts with legacy authentication, username, password, and you haven't looked at app users and OAuth, so this ability to put something in a key vault like a certificate or a client secret, if you're not doing that today, educate yourself if you're a developer, because
we already tipped on that.
Yeah,
precisely
I know.
Because app users, that's the only way around when non-interactive users, they just stop working in alt code. They just
exactly,
it just
dies.
breaks.
Yeah, and so it's a great way to, it takes a little bit of work, yes, but the other thing we hear from customers is, I don't know which user did whatever because my CRM service admin account, everyone and their sister has the password, and that's what they use, and oh my, not good.
And
right?
everyone is sysadmin, of course, yeah.
Right. And, you can apply conditional access policies to some degree, but I have a friend on the Azure AD team. And man, a lot of the really cool stuff you can do, you really can't do it unless you're using modern auth. So don't let the product or the code be the blocker. There are ways to unblock it. It takes a little bit of effort, but in my opinion, it's worth it, especially if you're going to get in there and service it. Just switch it over. I also maintain the PFE core libraries, so they let you do highly parallelized operations like fire 5 creates at the same time.
I was just about to ask you about that library. You sort of one step ahead of me. What's the future? I used it personally on a couple projects.
Yep.
But as I said, I don't work with the larger enterprise, and to me, the value of the library always been. I'm talking for people who don't know. I'm talking about PFE library, which is a wraparound kind of CRM API, so to speak, or SDK kind of libraries, but it brings in scalability, parallel processing, and things like that. So with the move to web API and so forth, what is the future of that library? So what's been done, and should not I consider using PFE library for, let's say, if I have an enterprise project and I do need scalability? Should I consider that library?
So I think for batch operations, you can. There's a V9 branch on GitHub because that's also open source, right? It's just, you're right, it's a wrapper, and it uses Service Client. There's a V9 branch. I haven't, mainly just because of time, had kind of a crazy travel schedule and other things going on. But I haven't like promoted that to its own folder back into the main branch yet, but it's pending. It's published on NuGet as a alpha or beta. I don't remember which one, but and you can pull it into your project and use it. And it uses Service Client, so you can do OAuth with it. You can, communicate using modern authentication, which has been a blocker. So should I use it? Shouldn't I use it? If you need to do a lot of things at once, like a lot, tens of thousands or sometimes even millions of operations. In the world of throttling and things being more real time and event driven, it's not an awesome pattern, right? Because that thing's going to get choked up every so often and get throttled. That's why we went to Service Client. So that's the other thing too. If you're using org service and struggling with throttles, going to Service Client will help you because Service Client has some built-in retry logic, which benefits this here too. So should I use it? If you need to get a lot of stuff done at once, yes, albeit there are throttles and other things to be concerned about in API operations. But, if you're looking at a scalable pattern that can be done that's multi-threaded, so to speak, multiple operations can happen at once and it's event-driven, and it's a bigger project, I'm again, big fan of Azure Functions and Service Bus and queuing, so that you don't lose these things and you can kind of have them run all the time. But I don't have an awesome answer, and there isn't a great I'll use this specifically here versus here. I think the core library is super useful in those scenarios where you've got big amounts of data or changes or deletions to process, or oh no, my workflow logs are insane because the job didn't run, or I turned off auto delete, or didn't check the box to delete upon success, and now I need to clean them up. It's a great way to throw up an Azure VM or a process and fire it off and just let it run overnight. But it is modern auth capable if you use the beta or alpha published binary on NuGet.
Do you have an implicit competition with Daniel Kai, who makes Kingsway Soft integration tools, who can do things faster? Right. So because
not really.
It's all
So I'm I know Daniel Kai pretty well. We've traded a ton of emails, and I've brought a lot of customers. I hopefully open their eyes when they have struggles with, I have a DBA team that knows SSIS, but I don't have enough CRM developers and I need all this work done. Hey, there's options, and this is one of them. And generally when customers do the bake off, good things happen. And the cool thing about Daniel Kai and Kingsway Soft is they stay very current. And I'm sure other add-ons stay current as well, but I know this one firsthand because a few of my customers use his product. And it's really great. And I will tell you that I've worked with Daniel. I've worked with other customers or companies as well on connectors on getting to modern authentication. Daniel kind of already had something going, but I shared with the patterns that we used for trying to be real low latency, and some of them translated into SSIS and some of them didn't. But anyway, there's no competition. I think they're two different platforms. SSIS is known by a lot of people, Dynamics fewer. You have integration runtimes in Azure. This is all stuff that you can click and drag, and the stuff I'm working on is more code based. And the beauty is my role at Microsoft has pretty much been do everything you can to work yourself out of a job, right? So try to get this customer into such a state that they don't need any help, and work really hard at doing it. And luckily technology continues to evolve. And when it was in support, it was do everything we can to drive down incidents so that we can immediately answer it. And this is one of those. I'd love to be out of the business.
Yeah. I totally can relate because I just dealt with the customer and they asked me for advice, and I said, why don't we do this, and this? And it was on Friday. And on Monday morning, I kind of reconnect with the customer, and they've done 90% of those things. And I'm kind of, oh, hold on. Did I just consult myself out of a job? Right, because they just went ahead and done and this and automated this and applied that and we done.
But I mean, yeah, it's funny. But on a serious note too, I love it because it takes so much time to do these things, and when you automate them, make them more reliable, and you don't spend time troubleshooting it in production, and you have a customer that can trust you. I could share stories, right? But you build the trust up with the customer, and all of a sudden the customer's like, I want to do this. And then because you've automated it, now you have the capacity to do it, whether it's on their team or your team or together. And the stuff that you can work on and the problems that you can solve, this sounds really pie in the sky, but it's closer to the business and closer to the user. And now all of a sudden the user doesn't care if PFE core library works or not. Well, they care if it doesn't work, if you have something that's waiting on it.
They will notice. They don't care. They will notice.
Right. But if you work on all of a sudden, how do we get text messages out faster, or the stuff that a lot of times you go, nah, it's not as big of a deal as this other thing. You get the other thing working really well. Now you can work on these things. This history reporting through with this customer I was telling you about with the Canvas app. We're talking that had been sitting on the back burner forever, because writing a UI, writing a tool, writing a website, deploying an app, writing the app, getting it approved, putting it in an app store, all of that was going to take weeks and weeks and weeks. And instead, we could go back and say, let's use the tools we have and really focus in on like what the questionnaire looks like and how to progress through. And anyway, but that wouldn't be possible if the toolkit wasn't there, but it also wouldn't be possible if we were busy fighting other things that have been broken that we just sort of let reside there, right, and fester.
So Shawn,
we should do totally take two, okay?
Absolutely.
I was going to say that, George, before you interrupted me.
All
right,
please.
So thank you, Shawn, for joining us. We definitely should. We have a lot more we could talk about. I didn't even get to ask the question I was asking you, Deacon, about what's the number one issues for support. We'll save that for a different time.
Sounds good.
So if people want to follow you, you mentioned the CRM in the Field blog. Is that the best place, or what social channels are you on?
So it's, if you look on Twitter, it's at Shawn, SeanMcne, Sean McNee. If you're on GitHub, you can check out github.com/SeanMcne, where I have a couple of the projects out there. But otherwise, Twitter's probably the best, or the Facebook group for the one that Menno maintains for Dynamics. And then the blog, of course, is where the rest of the team puts all their thoughts. And there's also PFE Dynamics, I believe, is our Twitter handle that the team tweets through when we put up new articles and stuff. So you can find us there. Hopefully not too hard to find.
All right. Well, thank you, Shawn, and thanks everybody for listening.